Takumi is an interesting character in Fire Emblem Fates. He has a fairly substantial role in both Birthright and Conquest, was pretty much the main character for the audio CD drama for the Birthright side, and just really popular, with him reaching 3rd in the male division of Japan's Fire Emblem Fates popularity poll, making him essentially the most popular Hoshiden character on the male side. As a unit, he's generally well regarded, however in Birthright especially, I found people say other characters may fill his role better despite the many things he has going for him. Usually due to the combination of enemy types, and his base and growths not being able to match up with units that come around and after his join time. Which made me wonder, how would Takumi perform in Conquest instead? And to throw a nuke of a wrench in the mix, let's pick Takumi from his build in one of the Conquest maps where he is the boss. Before I go on, I will clarify that I am far from an expert in Fire Emblem gameplay, let alone Fates. I've beaten Conquest Classic Lunatic, but otherwise I wouldn't say I am efficient nor optimal. So rather than a unit analysis, I'm approaching this mostly as just a fun thought experiment, where I try to rationalize how this poor boy would play in Conquest. After all, trying to think this stuff out before doing a replay of Fates is one of the most fun aspects of the game. That said, the biggest question to start with would be, which chapter would we grab him? I think there is no more proper place to grab Takumi in Conquest than in Chapter 10, with him being a potential recruitment. Let's just set the mental gymnastics aside with how that would work, especially later down the road, but let's say that it requires Corrin or Azura. I specifically will choose Chapter 10 here, as I feel that is the most interesting point where he could join. Chapter 6 is obviously too early, and having an archer with a 14 might bow instantly would automatically make him too good. Chapter 23 is a bit late for us to make any interesting builds that far in, especially with reclassing without support grinding, using certain features. Endgame wouldn't work either for obvious reasons, though slightly unrelated. I find the idea of having Takumi use Skadi for the whole game to be mad tempting to try, but I realize that wouldn't exactly be an interesting video, but it's a fun idea for a playthrough. Chapter 13 is a potential next best choice, but I feel like given the set of skills between the two chapters, I found Chapter 10 to have a skill I think would be really interesting, which I'll go over later. With all that said, I think this would alter the flow of how people will play the map. For one, it may motivate players even more to bum rush Takumi, and they don't need as much benchmarking. At least for the moment. The general way that I'm aware of to kill Takumi before he drains the water is to use Camilla paired up generally with Corrin to deal with the left side, but in this case, the method would be the same. However, you're gonna have to bring him back after you recruit him. Thankfully, Takumi's base stats are actually pretty alright given how it's impossible, especially his strength and a few other stats. And with the Fujin Yumi, along with him having weapon advantage against most of the enemies on the left side, Takumi should be able to handle himself, and after all that, you will instantly have another bow user to help support you. Just having an additional unit in Chapter 10 is incredibly valuable, having that be a bow unit even more so. Alternatively, choosing to recruit him very late into the chapter is a viable option, especially if you're extremely confident to near rout the enemies in Chapter 10. Of course, now that we have him for future chapters, the question of what we do with him may depend on how you'd like to play. In Conquest, I find bow users to be very valuable all throughout the game for one reason or another. And in this case, I think whether or not you'd want to use Takumi purely depends on if you want a second or even third bow user, assuming Bozu is in the picture. But really the best thing about Takumi, and why people may even want to consider using him for my scenario, is the theoretical nuke of a wrench I threw in there. His skill, Point Blank. Point Blank is a pretty easy to understand skill, being that it gives bow users one range. And this changes the game for Takumi. Not only do you get a relatively good unit early on, but you also get essentially an anti-flyer juggernaut, while also keeping the high damage output Takumi's strength provides. This helps him perform well or have it used for practically any point in the game, albeit after some investment. Chapter 11 is interesting because his point blank skill would actually be incredibly helpful for the left side, and that he is. Because firstly, he has Wary Fighter from Chapter 10, instantly negating the speed problem he may have. But he also has the Fujin Yumi. So any support that gives him even +1 to 2 strength, along with the accompanying tonics and meal to add to set strength to about 27 attack minimum, Takumi should be able to one-round any ninja that approaches him, minus Kaze, avoiding the lunge issue entirely. And with that, should also be able to take care of actually most of the entire map, assuming he is able to get the necessary heals. In Chapter 13, he'd be an incredible assets for the Wyverns, but that's not particularly unique to him. I'd imagine he'd actually be more helpful if ambush spawns were a thing for the enemy phase, but that isn't a thing in Fates, or would I exactly want that either? Though, his strength stat being so high makes it much easier for him to kill the knights that accompany the flyers early on. Those knights being paired with the Wyverns make it really hard to deal with, and having an extra unit that can absolutely maul them only helps. He also is pretty much able to take care of Reina super easily if he wanted to rush the thief at the bottom left the fastest. Chapter 14 is actually where things get much more interesting for Takumi, since by now, Takumi should have bulked up a bit, and with Point Blank, maybe one of the easiest ways to deal with the flyer reinforcements from the left side, making what was once an extremely annoying part of a chapter into a bloodbath. Pretty much at this stage, for Chapter 16, as Chapter 15 he wouldn't be accessible, is when I'd imagine you'd be able to find a partner for Takumi, assuming supports were handled properly. For this, I would choose Korin with the Samurai talent, because if you don't even want to marry this man for this run, why bother? This gives him the best potential set of skills to work with in the context of Conquest, in my opinion. Vantage combined with Point Blank, along with later down the road Astra and Life to Death, create quite a devastating combo. And 16 is where we would be able to lay down the groundwork. Samurai is also a safe class for Korin in my opinion regardless, so it's not like it would matter that much. Of course, I do think Chapter 16 is something that I find Xander handles best anyway, and with flyers not really being a concern to deal with for a while, I would use this chapter and the next to level him up to grab those skills in Samurai. After this point is when I continue start building up Takumi's class skills and really take advantage of as many things as possible, such as using paralogs, invasions, you name it, it only speeds up the process. And if you S-supported him with Korin by then, that already opens up 2 paralogs to get you started. Now in Chapter 17, if you stuck to your boat class still and wanted to save the paralogs for one more chapter, this is the last chapter I'd personally stick with bow Takumi before investing in reclasses. Here, Takumi with this extremely high offense will mop the floor, especially with a Xander plug. Bozu already has been considered to be a top tier unit for many people in this chapter, and Takumi would only be better here. Not to mention, his access to Wary Fighter continues to help him, especially if his speed stat just isn't there yet. There isn't much of note for Chapter 18 other than it being another way to give him skills. But Chapter 19, if he managed to get the skills you needed for Swordmaster and decided to swap to Master of Arms somehow, Takumi already having Wary Fighter along with most likely having Vantage from Samurai makes him a great potential Beast Killer candidate. He would also have Astra by then, only making his kills and pair-up guard activations more potent. Chapter 20, of course, is when I choose to reclass back into Sniper or Kinshi Knight depending on your preference. Of course, I would actually consider Mechanist as a class, if that was even possible. See, the issue is that there is no way for Takumi to go to Mechanist without Korin in this route. Kaze would have been the only option if he actually had supports with Takumi, therefore we would be losing out on an extremely enticing replicate skill for a personal skill competitive, which is the biggest reason why we would even want to go for it. But since we already have Point Blank available, the utility that Mechanist normally gives Takumi, that being daggers having 1 of 2 range access, is sort of redundant. With all that, Takumi should quite literally be unstoppable against the Falcon and Kinshi Knight forces in Chapter 20, which to me is the biggest hurdle in this chapter to deal with. If you went Kinshi Knight with Vantage, Takumi will be one of the few flying units who should be able to deal with both Kinshi Knights without needing to worry about himself, assuming he doesn't get one-shot and he's able to one-shot them back. Of course, if you went Sniper much earlier to get certain blow, that will 100% help him deal with the other Kinshi. And realistically, there ain't no way he wouldn't be able to with his stats. Sniper ultimately would be the better and safer choice if you don't need the flyer utility. Chapter 21 would vary depending on whether or not you have a low deployment count or chose him as a Kinshi Knight. His biggest boon really though would be his Dragon Vein access to freeze enemies, giving us a bit more flexibility regardless. In Chapter 22, he should be able to handle any flying reinforcements and also be an incredibly flexible unit once again due to Point Blank. Even without Point Blank, this chapter has multiple choke points keeping him relevant since he can attack through the walls. And since he has weapon advantage against Yukimura, it only makes it easier for him to deploy, especially with certain blow and already having a high hit rate. Chapter 23 is the start where I found enemies to start hitting much harder, which for Takumi shouldn't really be an issue, being you should focus on him being a 2-range unit. His point blank utility is helpful, but it's a situation where I usually have the super bulky units handle the majority of this chapter anyway. But since this is a Takumi video, we gotta try. If we invested enough EXP by now, you should have reached level 15, skills included, before Obero's room. Setting up Vantage, Point Blank, Rally, Tonics, and Meals, along with some other skills that may help him with damage, such as Life and Death, should allow him to handle that room for the most part. If his speed stat is high enough, taking off Wary Fighter at this stage of the game would be appropriate. Also, give him a Speed Wing. Would other units want it more? Sure, but if we didn't give it to Takumi, what's the point? Chapter 24 is where things, once again, become incredibly interesting. This chapter on Lunatic difficulty has nearly 20 or so flyers, and I think you can imagine what I'm getting at. Chapter 24, much like Chapter 21, is one of the chapters I found gets easier with low deployment. But with an anti-flyer death machine a Vantage Point Blank Takumi provides, this is what makes him super helpful. And while there are plenty of ways to trivialize this chapter, I have a burning desire for all those flyers here to die. And this is the way I want to do it. I mean, honestly, I planned the whole thing for this chapter in particular. Chapter 25, of course, purely depends on whether or not you want to play it or cheese it. Assuming we do it normally though, because of the fact that we still have access to Wary Fighter and Point Blank, Takumi still should actually be able to one-shot the ninjas in a map, especially in enemy phase. And with Vantage, it should basically guarantee his survival against ninja hell. Chapter 26 is a bit of a toughie, given his incredibly low res stat. It's hard for me to imagine him being a frontliner for the right side especially, but he makes a great support backliner with his bow. Now, Chapter 27 and Endgame become the real tests for Takumi. Well, actually just Endgame. Since Chapter 27, from my experience, can be handled by whoever can deal with Garen, but with Endgame comes the question, can Takumi defeat himself? Can Takumi be a Takumi killer? Is Takumi... Alright, the joke's worn off, but actually, yes, you should absolutely be able to. So, if we promoted him at level 17 and got to level 20, we get these averages. As you can see, if we have a Crescent Bow for the 4x hits, a paired up Berserker plus 8 Strength S support Korin with Strength Res Boon Bane, plus 4 Rally, and plus 1 Laszlo Rally, plus 4 from Quick Draw, plus 5 from Bowfair, plus 10 from Life and Death, plus 3 from Competitive, since Korin should really be level 20 by then, plus 3 from S-Rank Bows, all add up to about 77 attack, allowing Takumi to put his evil counterpart to rest, without the need for skill procs or crits. If Takumi can't reach S-Rank Bows by then, since we reclass quite a bit, and arm scrolls are just not an option, we can grab an energy drop from Chapter 18, or a shop, and a Dragon Herb from Midori's Paralog, or cheat, should reach that benchmark. Because if we're at Endgame, there isn't a cost too high to make Takumi absolutely slay. And that is how I would use Takumi, anyway, for this theoretical run. Honestly, the big thing here is that I built him around the point blank skill. If that wasn't a factor, and if I was forced to use his base set of skills, then I think I would use him much differently, somewhat. The biggest issue with Takumi overall though for Conquest is that he just won't have much reclassing capabilities available to him, assuming they don't give him anything to compensate for it. There are some things, but realistically, I think that is how I would plan my run for Takumi. But there may be some things I may have not really considered though. Would it be realistic for the average person to give him the proper investment before Chapter 20? I'm not sure. Would there have been a better class line? Better skill set? Maybe Mechanist is more worth it? All that and pretty much anything else I'd love to hear in the comments below. Giving a like and subscribe certainly wouldn't be bad either. I don't typically make content like this, but I definitely make Fire Emblem, especially Fates content, on just some neat stuff I don't see people talk about very often. And with that, that is all for this video. And I guess I will be seeing you guys sometime soon. Bye-bye!
LunarDave, welcome to the Takumi verse.